So here at Pondering Politics, one of my commitments was to have conversations with interesting people, and I've got a recurring guest here, and not to put too much burden on him, but he's my favorite damn senator, so that's a lot of pressure. We have the senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse. How are you, Senator?
I'm great. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
No, I appreciate you taking the time. So there's so much to discuss. You and I chatted briefly before the election. We talked a lot about the Supreme Court, and I imagine the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general is going to be a focus of this conversation today. On my channel, I complain a lot about the current state of the Supreme Court. My position, full disclosure, is that even though Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans, elected MAGA Republicans, are the immediate threat to democracy, so in my opinion, the current Supreme Court is a looming threat to democracy, no less dangerous, just a bit more ominous and shadowy. So to people like
one that voters can't correct.
Correct. And really, so I'd like to start there. So we hear this, I call it a canard, and I cite your counterpart, Jamie Raskin, who I imagine you work quite closely with because you two seem to have similar views. You know, he wrote a brilliant op-ed a few years ago, sir, where he said, actually, we don't have three co-equal branches. Congress was always supposed to be the predominant branch. You all were supposed to be the final hand on top. And actually, the founders intended for the judiciary to be the weakest of the three branches, weaker even than the president. Not impotent, but weaker. Sir, it seems like we have actually the opposite situation where the Supreme Court has put itself above not just the presidency, but also you all. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, and the worst part is that this is not a Supreme Court that is on a strange and unique vanity exercise to aggregate as much power to itself as it can. It is the end product of a very significant effort by right-wing billionaires who spent hundreds of millions of dollars and decades to build a massive infrastructure, very covert, clandestine infrastructure, and use it to capture the court. And even as we speak, those right-wing billionaires have flotillas of phony front groups that make completely inadequate disclosures about their funding and connections with each other and connections with the billionaires who go in and tell this court what to do. If this were just a couple of vainglorious justices off on a wild roll, that would be a very different thing. This is not. The court has really become the policymaking appendage of this right-wing billionaire network that is extremely dangerous to democracy.
Justice Alito famously said last year, and it was shocking given that the damn Constitution says it so plainly, that he doesn't believe that Congress has the authority to regulate the courts. And I'm curious because not only has he said this, it seems that the right-wing supermajority is reticent to deal with Congress. I believe that under Senator Durbin, you all invited Chief Justice Roberts to explain some of these ethical lapses. And respectfully, sir, he basically gave you all the finger. He said, absolutely not. So I'm curious, are you surprised at the boldness of these justices to defy the predominant branch of government?
Yeah, they clearly are trying to protect themselves from a lot of very basic rule of law parameters. One, obviously, is congressional oversight. The other is our ability to structure, particularly the administrative side of the court's apparatus. The court is run through the Judicial Conference, which was established by Congress. So to say that we don't have the authority to do this makes no sense. It violates history as much as it does the Constitution. And they also have protected themselves from fact-finding so that when they misbehave, there's no place where the truth will out. The entire investigation ends with whatever a justice chooses to say or not to say, but there's no neutral fact-finding, which is congressional oversight and neutral fact-finding are pretty damn basic principles of American governance. So when they sever themselves from that, that's a signal that they really don't want this billionaire-funded, billionaire-structured operation looked into. And if you don't mind me going on, the Alito quote came out of a very interesting set of facts. He went to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is heavily funded by the same group of polluter billionaires. He allowed himself to be interviewed about a matter that would likely come before the court, which they all tell us in their nomination hearings is improper. It wasn't just a matter that might hypothetically come before the court. It was an ongoing legal dispute. And the interviewer of Alito was a lawyer taking a side in that ongoing legal dispute and essentially recruiting Alito as an expert witness. Worse, the client of that lawyer was a personal friend of Alito's. And worse, the gravamen of the dispute was whether we would have access to information about the improper billionaire-funded travel records of Sam Alito. So it's a whole layer cake of stacked up ethics violations just in that one interview. And of course, no way to have anybody look at it because they've created this immunity bubble around themselves.
Yeah, I'd forgotten some of the intricacies. Like, it seems like everywhere you turn, you're brushing up against an ethics violation. While you were talking, I seem to remember, and this may have been after you and I spoke the first time, there was bombshell New York Times reporting about how Chief Justice Roberts took an unprecedented step of removing Alito from the majority opinion assignment after it was revealed that the flag scandal came to light. Even though Alito had been assigned to write the majority of opinion, Roberts basically jumped on that particular grenade, leaving many of us to speculate, what was his motivation for doing? Because if Chief Justice Roberts felt that it would be, that it would violate propriety to have Alito write a majority opinion on a January 6th related case after flying these insurrectionist flags at his home, then perhaps it would have been grounds for Alito to recuse himself. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, sir. So, we're talking about these in concrete terms. You have been a very passionate defender of Supreme Court reform, and I should ask, with regards to the recent election, I've never been a professional candidate for office, so I understand the considerations are different. But given the polling around the Supreme Court, it's the lowest it's been in decades. I think there was a Marquette Law School poll which said, term limits, strict recusal requirements, strict ethics requirements, all of these things are wildly popular with the American people. In hindsight, do you wish that you and the party had made it more of a political priority? Because I've heard things from other commentators suggesting that it was too controversial to really make it a campaign issue. So I was curious where you fell on this.
Yeah, I think that we should have put a lot more attention into this. It's hard to make it a big political issue if the party's standard bearer doesn't want to make it a big political issue. And clearly, President Biden wanted no part of this as a political issue. If you'll recall, when he set up the Supreme Court Commission, which was essentially a deflection operation, the major issues that many of us presented to that commission were never addressed in the commission report. And it took two of the commissioners, Lawrence Tribe and Judge Gertner, to write a separate opinion answering or addressing all those questions that were raised that the commission report had not even bothered to address. And they weren't allowed to even put it into the commission report as alternative or dissenting views. They had to write it timed to the day of the release of the report as an op-ed in a newspaper. So clearly we have, I think, underappreciated the importance of this issue. And then, you go back the last 20 years while they were carefully stalking and preparing the work and the structure for capturing the court. And most of that was done, I don't want to say in plain view, but pretty close to plain view. If you knew what to look for, you could see what was happening. And we just didn't bother as Democrats. So I think we have to have a real reckoning with ourselves about how we let the court get captured, dark money completely pollute our politics, and fraudulent climate denial dominate the problem of climate change. All three of those things have something in common, which is creepy right-wing billionaires behind the scheme. And so when you just wait and look at this as like, here's an individual problem, let's react to that. And you aren't going at, Moscow Central. If you aren't going at the Death Star, you're going to just lose and lose and lose. And I'm afraid that's where we've been and why we are where we are.
I appreciate you saying that. This is one of the reasons why I was not exaggerating when I said you're my favorite senator, because you've been probably the boldest voice in the Senate about this. My fear is that Democrats overestimate the energy of the American people. What I mean by that is, I feel that in hindsight, we felt that the aftermath of the Dobbs decision was going to carry us to victory, as it did effectively in 2022 and in the off-year elections in 2023. But the American people, even on an issue as important as abortion, sir, we can get used to anything. And so right now, the iron was hot. People were pissed off at the Supreme Court in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, reports about Clarence Thomas's corruption. And yes, my fear is that there are some people who think, okay, well, they're going to be pissed off about it next year. No, not necessarily. I'm 33 years old. I have never lived under a liberal or even balanced Supreme Court, and I wake up and go to sleep every night. We can get used to this, and that's my fear. I hope that as you all plan for the future, and we'll talk about this at the end, that you all are keeping in mind that aggressive Supreme Court reform needs to be a campaign priority as much as you're able to make it. So
I think that's important. I think that we have 4 years before we're going to be able to do anything legislatively, because Trump is going to veto anything. We don't control either house. So we have no legislative pathway until at least the next presidential election. And then we'd actually have to win both houses also. What we do have, I think, is a very real chance of the House returning to Democratic control in 2026. And that gives the House the capacity to do a really good investigation. We tried in the Senate. We did some work in Judiciary. We did some very good work in the Finance Committee. But at the end of the day, we kind of banged up against the fact that you can't subpoena somebody in the Senate without an enforcement action that has to go through the Senate floor that can be filibustered. And the Republicans told the world, we're going to filibuster all this. Over at the House, there is no filibuster on a House subpoena. So a rigorous House investigation, like the January 6th Commission, with subpoena power, with significant professional staff, putting the real work into looking at how long this capture operation ran, how it was funded, how it was operated, who the key personnel were, what its major accomplishments were, who paid for it and how. That whole structure. How many times did Ginny Thomas get another $25,000 payment through Leonard Leo? I mean, there's just an enormous amount to look at. And so that's really our next moment of truth is the 2026 election, the House, and a real investigation into what the Supreme Court has been covering up.
Well, I'm hoping by 2028 we'll have the ultimate scenario, which is, a trifecta where Jamie Raskin's in charge on the House, perhaps a Sheldon Whitehouse chairman of the Judiciary Committee. One can only hope. I do want to talk to you because you said so many things there that really merit unpacking. Let's talk about the Judicial Conference going back a bit, because I was surprised. I shouldn't have been surprised. I was kind of surprised that you had a recent exchange with the Judicial Conference. Actually, let's first do this. Senate Democrats just released within the past couple of weeks a report, like an exhaustive investigation into the ethics violations of the Supreme Court. Can you briefly summarize the findings? Because I think that that's an important predicate for what I'm about to ask.
Well, basically, it was that the Supreme Court has been the recipient of enormous personal gifts. Justices have, certain justices in particular, and that they have tended to come from right-wing billionaires who have demonstrated records of efforts to influence the court in other ways. They fund 501c3s and 501c4s whose job it is to influence the court, for instance, and that the alignment between the interests of the right-wing billionaires, the gifts program that they've run for the amenable Supreme Court justices, and then the outcomes that are produced by those Supreme Court justices at the end of the day was pretty bad. And was undisclosed and was probably undisclosed in violation of law, not just in violation of the laws about disclosure, but there's some real likelihood that the failure to disclose signaled also a failure to report for tax purposes. And so there could be a very short bounce into tax fraud, either by the billionaires not paying gift tax on the gift taxes they were, on the gifts they were providing, or by the justices as income tax on the income that they were receiving. For instance, the $267,000 loan by a private individual to Justice Thomas for his motor coach, when forgiven, became an incidence of income, both under tax and disclosure laws. Didn't disclose it on the forms, suggesting he might not have disclosed it on his tax reports either, in which case you now have a justice who's engaged in tax fraud, and there's no investigation, there's no factual determination. It's just left out there as a big fat question.
Is it possible that we're going to read a quote from Justice Thomas maybe tomorrow about how tax laws are actually a violation of judicial independence and the Supreme Court shouldn't be beholden to them?
That's right. It's an outrage for the legislature to treat Supreme Court justices as people have to follow even the tax laws, let alone any others.
How dare you try to violate judicial independence, Senator? Remind me, was this where, because I seem to recall, and I thought it was at the conclusion of this investigation, wasn't there a referral to the Justice Department over this report, or did it precede the report?
The referral to the Justice Department came from me and from Chairman Wyden of the Finance Committee, based on our Finance Committee investigation into the forgiveness of the loan to Justice Thomas. It is unbelievably simple. The equation that forgiveness of a loan equals income. It's elementary tax law. And so we asked the Attorney General to investigate based on the predication that the disclosure hadn't been made, that maybe the report hadn't been, the tax return hadn't included this, and that we should have a look at that. Moreover, there are false statements that are likely made. It's one thing to have just a disclosure violation, but if it's really deliberate, then it's an 18 United States Code, Section 1001, false statement, which can be a felony. So the prospect that a Supreme Court justice committed a false statement felony and tax fraud had been, I think, adequately predicated by our investigation to justify a further and proper investigation by the Department of Justice with the proper facilities to get to the bottom of this.
You know, my next question is, what did you hear back from DOJ?
Not a zip, nothing, crickets.
This is, I'm not asking you to co-sign this. I'm just, as a point of dialogue, I'm just expressing, I believe Attorney General Garland is an ethical man. I think he's a good man. I think he's a smart man. But sometimes it seems to me that there is a perception of fecklessness from DOJ. And I promise you, Senator, this is not going to help that reputation. I will also say, speaking of the Judicial Conference, which is what I was getting to, I was surprised to read a letter to you, I believe, from the Judicial Conference, where they were like, Senator, the Judicial Conference, I mean, it's not our job to make recommendations or referrals to the Attorney General or to really, investigate whether Supreme Court justices violated, financial disclosures and ethics rules. Were you surprised by how I was just stunned at how explicit they were like, no, it's not our job, Senator?
Yeah. Let me start by saying that I meet with the Judicial Conference regularly, every 6 months, in my role as the chair of the Courts Subcommittee, Judiciary. And for a long time now, for several years, I've been using that every 6 months opportunity to present to them ethics problems at the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice sits right next to me. He's the chair of the Judicial Conference, and we've had considerable success. When I disclosed to them what Justice Scalia had created, which was the exemption that if you get a personal invitation from a resort owner, you can go stay at the resort for free and not report that you got this freebie, because it's a personal invitation and therefore personal hospitality. Well, of course, every single one of the circuit court chief judges knew that that was completely bogus. So they rewrote the rule to clarify that that was wrong. Then I pointed out the phony baloney Supreme Court amicus brief practice that is happening with these groups that are funded by the billionaires and don't disclose it, which included a group that is a front group for billionaires, but it also has a fictitious name that it operates under Virginia corporate law. And they filed a brief under the fictitious name without even reporting who they were in reality. And so things like that kind of blew the minds of the Judicial Conference members. And so they're in the process now of cleaning up that mess. So we've had some considerable success. I think this one was my first disappointment. And I'm still trying to digest it because it's complicated. But let's just say it was very, very disappointing to have them say that they were not willing to make a determination as to whether the Justice Thomas the repeated failures to disclose might have been willful. That's the standard. If they might have been willful, that triggers an obligation of law, a statute passed by Congress, never contested by the court before, that you then make the referral to the Attorney General, which is the obvious thing to do from a checks and balances point of view, to avoid the judicial branch just covering up and self-dealing mischief within its ranks. So everything about it seemed pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. And this enormously complicated letter came back to us that went through a variety of different hoops, but ended up with, so we're just not going to do it.
Yeah,
So
I was stunned by the just the explicitness of the letter.
Yeah.
I have so many important questions to ask you. Just real quick, Senator. Let's start with this one. Right now, there's a right-wing Supreme Court majority. What do you think about the prospects of a MAGA majority by the end of Donald Trump's second term? Do you think that that is likely, that Justices Alito and Thomas will retire, and that Donald Trump will have left office appointing five Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Thomas is the oldest and perhaps the most likely to retire. It's hard to get more MAGA than him. He was MAGA before there was MAGA.
Proto-MAGA.
So it's hard to know, how you make things much worse than having him on the court. I suppose Judge Ho or a Justice Ho, Justice Cannon could make it worse. And then same
for longer.
with Alito. Alito is really, I think, in my view, at least, really disgraced himself, and it's hard to imagine much worse. So as long as the Democrat-appointed justices remain healthy, and as long as Roberts and Barrett remain healthy and don't go anywhere, and Kavanaugh is there's a huge question mark over him. I think he's still trying to redeem his reputation after the way he was confirmed. That's a 6-member court that could make a certain amount of sense. And it's these two, I think, Thomas and Alito, who've been the worst problem children there. And if they were to be replaced, I don't think it's that damaging. I think that where it really gets bad is if those other justices, I should say, retire or otherwise leave the court.
Oh, I'm just thinking about the duration, as you say. Given Alito and Thomas's age, if they were replaced with like-minded people in their 40s or 50s, then we could be dealing with the MAGA majority court for a generation,
for a long time.
Woo,
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
that's a really harrowing prospect.
Yeah.
The So we're
At
talking
some
about,
point, the other judges have to begin to fight back, and I hear from judges all the time, including ones from red states who've been appointed by Republicans, who see me in an airport or see me at a gathering. These aren't my Rhode Island federal judges. These are others who I often have never met, don't know. And they come up and they say, "Are you Sheldon Whitehouse? Thank you for your work, because it's really important to us that you try to clean up what's going on at the Supreme Court, because it's making all of us look bad." To which I reply when it's appropriate, "Well, you know, you got a pen.
could you
You've
go on
got
the
a
record,
mouth.
please?
Yes,
Yeah.
say something. Tell your people in the judicial conference this actually needs to be cleaned up." So maybe there's more to come that's good out of the judicial conference based on that broad sense, I think, throughout much of the federal judiciary, that the Supreme Court is doing the judicial branch of government no favors with its continued misbehavior and with its inability to put itself under such basic rules that all 50 of the state Supreme Courts have figured out how to do it. So it's not like this is hard. They just won't.
No, again, to me, it's like that their notion of checks and balances is that they can dispense checks and balances, but are not beholden to them. And since then, I've been doing deep dives into like judicial, even conservative judicial scholars like Michael Stokes Paulson, about how notions of judicial review have really become judicial supremacy. And again, as immediate and dangerous as the Trump threat is, and I don't take that for granted,
Yeah.
eyes are on that appropriately. But the Supreme Court, in my view, is no less dangerous in its current iteration. And I look forward to a time where bold Democratic majorities bring it to heel. And on that topic, it was reported that you wrote a letter to Democratic Party chairs about wargaming, resistance to Republican attacks or Republican political shenaniganry. Could you explore that a bit more? Because I found that really interesting, and not at all surprising given who you are. But this is a bold step. Can you talk about this?
The DNC has to think about how it's going to operate in this new environment, and they have to choose a new party chair. And there are some very qualified candidates who I'm not choosing among. But it's also a chance for the DNC to look at itself as an organization and to look at the Democratic Party and have that reckoning I talked about at the beginning of our conversation. Why is it that we got beat by the climate denial operation, even though it's fraudulent? Why is it that we got beat at the court capture operation, even though it was done somewhat in plain view, where somebody paying attention would have noticed? How is it that we got beat on the dark money operation, even though people across the country hate, loathe, and despise it? We are getting beat not because we're wrong, not because the policies aren't good, not because we don't care. We're getting beat because we don't have an operation that can push back effectively against this massive operation that the creepy billionaires have set up. And we don't spotlight their misbehavior. We don't spotlight their conflicts of interest. We don't even spotlight who's who. 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think most members of the Senate on the Democratic side even knew who Leonard Leo was.
Even though they were living in his shadow.
Even though they're living in his shadow. And they didn't know the groups. Nobody complained that the fictitious name organization filed the brief without revealing what the actual organization was, because the actual organization was the one that funded the ads for the Trump Supreme Court justices. So there's a story to be told there, but nobody knew it. There was no research base where we can get the truth out and respond in real time to mischief. There's no place where we can have a strategy session. There's no place where, Gretzky says, skate to where the puck is going. There's no place where we have people sitting down saying, okay, where's the puck going on climate? Where's the puck going on this issue or that issue? It's not a question of doing it badly. It's a question of we don't have the infrastructure. You go back to ancient times when people were throwing spears and firing arrows at each other. And before the battle, the tribes would get together and there'd be a tent and they'd talk about, okay, we're going to send the cavalry around the hill and all of your, spear carriers are going to go straight in, and we're going to have our archers over here. And this is our battle plan for the battle tomorrow. And we don't do that. We don't have that. And they've got this massive infrastructure, probably north of 100 groups. Think like piano keys. You know, each piano key is separate, but they're all the same damn piano. And we don't even point out that aspect of what we're up against. And I think with a spotlight on it, the American public will be stunned to see that a lot of what is happening to them didn't happen. It was done. And it was done at the behest of these creepy billionaires using huge fortunes to try to make their fortunes bigger. And that story is what we have been unable to get out because we don't have the command center, the research center, the operations room, the war room, whatever you want to call it, to push back against the most comprehensive and corrupt political operation in American history, in my view.
Well, and it's gotten more corrupt now because in addition to creepy billionaires, you've just added the creepiest and biggest billionaire in the world, Elon Musk. I wouldn't be surprised if, as part of his push to turn everything right wing, he takes focus on the judiciary as well to take a really bad situation and make it worse. I want to be respectful of your time, but I've got two more quick questions. One of them is on the blue slip. When you and I spoke last, I mentioned, hey, during our next conversation, I have a question for you about the blue slip. I didn't know what the hell the blue slip was until you. Actually, I watched a hearing after President Biden was elected, and you explained to your Republican counterparts who were very upset that you did not restore the blue slip to circuit judges, I believe, even though they were the ones who revoked it, enabling Donald Trump to cram through his nominees over your objections. The Judiciary, Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee made the decision to not restore it, which I support. A lot of people, myself included, would have preferred you also remove it for district court judges, and here's why. Not only do I believe that Republicans will revoke the blue slip for district judges in the next term, the moment it's convenient, but hindsight being 2020, I believe it's one of the reasons why Judge Cannon was assigned the classified documents case. Obviously, you had no way to predict that, but because there were fewer judges, that case got assigned to her. Now that the Senate majority is in the hands of the Republicans, I do have a question for you. Number one, do you expect that Republicans will revoke the blue slip for district judges? And number two, in hindsight, do you wish you would have revoked it for district judges so as to allow President Biden to fill these vacancies over Republican objection?
I do not expect that they will revoke the blue slip for district judges. I think that they pretty much have what they want now. There is a MAGA pathway through the court system up to the Trump-controlled Supreme Court. There are a lot of entry points, with Aileen Cannon being one obvious one, but Kaczmarek, the judge in Texas, is another obvious one. The judge in Louisiana who threw out the social cost of carbon to protect the fossil fuel industry is another one. You can get in quite easily to that slipstream, and then you go to the circuit courts that they control, and then you go on up to the Supreme Court, and it really doesn't matter how many regular judges there are. As long as you have your pathway, you can get the political stuff that you want done. And I think, first of all, Lindsey Graham is still on the judiciary. He's very senior, and he protected it when he could have thrown it under the bus. Chuck Grassley is a bit of an institutionalist. He's the chair. He's been the chair before. He didn't violate it before. I don't think he wants to. Thune, I think, as the new majority leader, is even less beholden to the billionaires and to this whole dark money court capture scheme than Mitch McConnell was, who was neck deep in it. And so if McConnell couldn't force it, then I don't see them forcing it now. And what helps us Democrats in all of this is that if you look at the layout of where there are judges, it tends to be by population. And so there are actually more judges in states where Democrat senators get to make a nomination than there are in states where Republican senators get to make a nomination. So it may seem crazy that North and South Dakota get 4 votes and California only gets 2. But when you go back and look at the count of judges, they have a handful and California has a boatload. So for us to give away our control over those district courts would be actually worse than to, fuss with the Republican senators about getting those seats filled. I would prefer, if the seat was filled too long, to press through the Appropriations Committee to have the seats stripped. If you're not going to fill it, if you say
what's the point of having it?
What's the point of having it? We'll just shut that down, save some money.
No, fair enough. I appreciate that. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to pose that question to you, because from an outsider's perspective, it didn't make much sense to me. So I'm glad you were able to clarify some of the decision. My last question for you, and this is kind of encapsulates some of what you were talking about earlier, but the way I look at it, people, not just voters, but even people like me, political commentators, people who are on the outside, we're worried, Senator. The presidency is back in the hands of an authoritarian. His party controls the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, a majority of state legislatures, the media, which, going back to your, war game prospect, I think the media situation is something you all will have to address, because they control Fox. They control a lot of alternate media. Like, people in my space, we are dwarfed by right-wing commentators. And so you take all of this in consideration, Elon Musk, Twitter, Facebook bending the knee. I think what a lot of us want to know is, we don't expect you all to have a plan at this point, or to even publicly reveal it, given how close it was to the election. But are you and your colleagues, and especially your colleagues, are they aware that this is not a typical election? This is not business as usual. This is not losing to Mitt Romney in 2012 or John McCain in 2008. And that there is a plan to not only take back power, but to wield it decisively, boldly, in the way that I know you want to do. Is this a more common sentiment, or you don't have to name names, or are your colleagues thinking, oh, this is just another Republican victory?
I think, it's hard for me to speak for 46 other different colleagues who are all very independent-minded individuals, but I do think people understand the dangers of a Trump presidency, the political opportunities created by what is almost certain to be virtually unmitigated corruption and self-dealing by his billionaire cabinet and all the cronies that he's put into positions of power, and that we have a responsibility to meet the moment by taking on that corruption and protecting the fundamental institutions of democracy that have held firm for, in some cases, 230 years now. So 250 years now, nearly. We're coming up. So we have, I think there's a strong sense of the importance of this moment. And what I'm hoping is that there'll be a strong sense that one of the reasons we're in this position is because we let ourselves get beat by bigger, better infrastructure, and we didn't bring the same planning and the same determination to the field. We basically sent, our football team out onto the field without chalk talks, game films, playbooks, all of that stuff that you do to win, and without an offensive coordinator to advise on what the best plays to run would be, and to think ahead to the second and third quarter when you're only in the first quarter. That's the infrastructure that we have got to build for ourselves. And that's going to be a learning experience because we just haven't had it.
Well, I appreciate that answer. I think a lot of people are going to be encouraged that, you don't take it for granted. It's like, no, everything's going to be fine. This is business as usual. Or, no, we have all the answers. I like the fact that you're being upfront with, this is a serious opportunity. We have to learn lessons, and we're currently exploring ways to address it in the future. Senator, I could talk to you for 4 hours. I appreciate your time so very much. I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the future. Is there anything before you go you wanted to shout out? A new book coming, a new initiative, anything going on in the world of Sheldon Whitehouse?
No, nothing particular like that. I think that if there was one thing that I would flag, it's that, again, looking Gretzky-like at where the puck is going to be. We've been through the science era of climate change, and the scientists did their jobs and gave us the warnings and predictions that we needed. We entered the political era of climate change when we were supposed to heed those warnings, and we catastrophically failed because we were, as an institution, Congress was corrupted by the fossil fuel industry. And so now we're entering the era of consequences. And they're burning right now in LA. They are upheaving insurance markets in Florida and in Texas and in other places. And I think we're going to see enormous economic upheaval driven by the cascade of climate risk to uninsurability to unmortgageability, if you can't insure a property, to property values crashing because if you're not a billionaire, you probably need a guy with a mortgage to come buy your house. You're not just going to get a cash buyer. So that slide economically is something that I think we can push back at the corruption of the fossil fuel industry and the Republicans who bought into it, who took their money, lied about climate science, and have now precipitated what is going to be some real economic pain that is going to fall not just on Republicans, not just on Democrats, but across America. So I think we need to be really alert to preparing that argument, laying the foundation for that argument, so that as it becomes more apparent to Americans how they were misled by the fossil fuel industry and the Republican Party, that there's a time of consequence that we can take advantage of.
Senator, well put. Thank you so much for drawing attention to that. I know that's another passion of yours, is, extolling the very real consequences of climate change, taking on two very formidable threats, the Supreme Court of the United States and climate change. I appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the future.
Great to be with you, Josiah. Thank you.